So you're a software engineer and you're thinking about working for Meta. Here's the massive question you need to resolve. Where do you fit into their structure? Let's say you're a senior engineer in your current company, but with Meta, you're hearing about these E levels, E4, E5. How does that translate to your current position? In this video, I'm going to break it down for you. And how do I know? I've never worked for Meta, but I've worked for over a decade in the same area as their European headquarters. And I know quite a few engineers who went through the recruitment process, and some are still there now. So Kyle, who is a career coach in this channel, asked me to do some local research and present the reality behind their career pages. So here it is. Here is the Rosetta Stone for Meta's engineering levels. I'm going to focus most of this video on the lower section, as that's where you're most likely to land. But before I go to the levels, I do want to address Meta's official philosophy on titles. For individual contributors, in other words, non-managers, titles don't officially exist. Levels are supposed to be hidden. Everyone is just a software engineer. The theory is that this creates a meritocracy where the best idea in the room wins, not the person with the most senior title. That's the theory, but let's be real. The reality on the ground is a little different. Inside the building, levels are pretty much an open secret. They do influence who gets what projects and what's expected of you. Okay, having got that out of the way, let's look at this ladder from the ground up. This ladder starts from E3. What happened to E1 and E2? They're locked in a basement in Dublin, moderating comments. They survive on Guinness and potatoes. Nah, I'm jesting. Facebook got rid of human moderators, right? Seriously, I suspect that E1 and E2 are reserved for interns, maybe even for high school work experience. We can safely ignore those levels for our purposes. E3 is the entry level for people at the early point of their careers. This is for new grads or maybe people with 1 to 2 years experience at another company. At this level, you're expected to take well-defined tasks and just deliver solid, high-quality code. At other companies, this is a junior engineer. E4 is what many companies would consider to be mid-level software engineers. At E4, you now own the features you're working on. You're defining the requirements, documenting the spec, reaching out and collaborating with other teams. If you've got 3 to 5 years of experience at another company, this is likely where you land. But you'll need to demonstrate at interview that you've done more than just write good code under instructions handed to you. That's E3. Make sure you're prepared to discuss how you defined the requirements from a reasonably large change request, or how you collaborated with another team to utilize their framework. Now, E5 is senior engineer at other companies. At E5, you own projects. You define the scope of the project, you mentor the E3s and the E4s in the project, and you drive all the technical alignment. You are fully responsible for quality of delivery. There are plenty of people who stay at E5 for a long, interesting, and financially rewarding career. Now, let's say you're a senior engineer at your current company and you've had that title for several years. Don't be surprised if you go through the interview process at Meta and you find yourself at E4. You'll have ample opportunity, and there'll be a certain expectation that you show enough initiative and technical leadership to advance up a rung to E5 within 1 to 2 years. That should net out financially advantageous for you. The jump from E5 to E6 is seriously large in terms of scope and influence. At E5, you own projects. At E6, your responsibility expands way beyond that. You're now responsible for an entire problem space, a whole area of technical challenge for the team and often beyond. This is often called staff engineer at other companies. Your influence stretches beyond your immediate team. You're solving meaty technical problems that cross team boundaries. Your work is starting to directly impact the goals of the entire organization. You're an individual contributor, but you're spending a lot of time talking, presenting, and evangelizing your technical proposals. Does that last piece sound like not a whole lot of fun? That's why a lot of people choose to stick at E5. I think most of you are interested in the levels of E4 to E6, but it's worth knowing what goes on with E7, E8, and E9. But let me try and translate this into your current company, particularly a large enterprise. If you're at the equivalent level of an E7, your impact is felt across the entire organization. You lead massive sprawling programs that span multiple divisions. It could be an overhaul of the entire employee administration system. Jump to E8, and you're driving innovation that has an impact beyond your company. These are industry leaders whose work is shaping the global technology landscape. Part of your role is giving TED Talks or the opening speeches at major conferences. E8 and E9s are the visionaries setting the long-term strategy of the company. And Meta, they're in the room with Mark Zuckerberg. I stopped at 9 on the ladder, but there is an E10. This is the fellow. Insiders say there are maybe 3 in Meta, so we won't spend much more time considering it. So now I've gone through the levels, let's clarify the roles. I'm assuming that you're interested in the software engineering role at Meta. Just so as you're not misdirected by an unwitting recruiter, I want to call out that there are similar roles with similar names in Meta, but not all engineers are compensated equally. There is another role that's pretty much on a par, and that's the production engineer, the PE. You can think of this as an SRE or site reliability engineer at other companies. They bridge the gap between the product and the infrastructure. And because this role is so impactful, the compensation isn't markedly different to a software engineer. Then you've got the business engineer and the enterprise engineer. These are coding roles, but business engineers focus on external partners and enterprise engineers are working on internal tools. My understanding is that these roles can be 20 to 30% below the total compensation for the equivalent SWE. And this is because stock comes into the equation and it's at a lower level. So if you're considering an offer, make sure you know what the exact role is. There's one more aspect that I want to mention because it does come as a surprise to some new hires, and that's how integrated the teams are. As a software engineer, you're not just working with other software engineers, you're working side by side within the same team with data scientists and data engineers. You're all contributing to the project success from different angles. So after all of that, the big question is still there. Where do you fit in? Let's walk through a pretty straightforward framework that you can use to map your own experience to these different levels. The key here is to ignore your current job title for a moment. Instead, look at your work across 3 dimensions: scope, influence, and impact. Ask yourself, am I owning tasks, features, or entire problem spaces? The level goes up depending on where you're putting yourself there. Another question: does my work affect just my team, or does it ripple out to wider teams and indeed to the whole organization? Again, 3 levels. Most importantly, when it comes to the interview, what have I actually tangibly changed or enabled? That's what's really going to define your level. So now you understand the levels at Meta, I'm going to hand over to Kyle, the career coach on this channel.
Thanks for that breakdown, Margaret. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. What about all the layoffs? Look, it's true. There have been layoffs across big tech, including at Meta. But here's what many people don't realize. Even with workforce reductions, Meta still needs to hire. They're constantly replacing talent, filling critical roles, and building new teams for emerging projects. See these open positions? This isn't just for show. Companies like Meta operate on what I call the talent refresh cycle. People leave for startups, retire, move to different companies. Plus, there are always new initiatives that need specific expertise. If you're serious about landing one of these positions, you need more than just technical skills. You need to understand how to tell your story, how to demonstrate impact at the right level, and how to ace those specific interview formats. I'll be covering all this in upcoming videos on this channel. Specifically, I'll be sharing strategies for crafting your resume to highlight the impact Meta cares about, preparing for those coding and system design interviews, negotiating your level and compensation package, and much more. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because when it comes to landing a job at Meta, preparation is everything.